After over 3 years of brutal war between Ukraine and Russia, the two countries are finally talking to each other directly to discuss an end to it all, with Zelensky even saying he's willing to meet Putin face to face to discuss peace. These negotiations could be monumental in ending Europe's bloodiest conflict since World War II. Welcome to Buried Origins. Now, there's a lot going on right now with the negotiations over Ukraine, and the entire process is very chaotic, involving a whole collection of different interest groups, with their own objectives, forms of leverage, and red lines. But today I'll try to clear things up a bit. So, let's get into it. Okay, so first, let's identify the 4 main interest groups that are playing the largest part in the war. Obviously, Ukraine and Russia as the two countries fighting, but also the US and European Union as Ukraine's strongest supporters. Other individual countries like the UK, France, and Germany have a decent amount of influence, but they're limited in their ability to individually impact the negotiations, and so they won't be discussed too much here. Now, what are all these powers negotiating over? Well, to oversimplify it, it's essentially how strong Ukraine should be, or put another way, how easy it should be for Russia to conquer it. Of course, Russia currently wants to take complete control of Ukraine, and while it's failed to achieve that on the battlefield, it still wants Ukraine to be as weak as possible as the result of any negotiations. Now, the EU and Ukraine want Ukraine to be as strong as possible, while the US under President Trump simply wants to get a deal through no matter what. And so the negotiations are essentially an attempt to find some sort of middle ground between the two positions of a strong Ukraine and a weak Ukraine. Now, of course, that's oversimplifying it, but for our discussion, it'll simply have to do. Now, these recent negotiations strangely started only between the US and Russia, and didn't even involve Ukraine. And we'll get into why later, but for now, let's dig deeper into Russia's position. Now, for Russia, its nightmare scenario is a strong Ukraine in NATO, and a major NATO army 300 miles from Moscow. That plays on a longer history of the Soviet Union being afraid of a NATO attack, which was a major reason for their policy of creating a defensive buffer zone in Central and Eastern Europe to defend against such an event. After the Soviet Union fell apart, almost every country in the buffer zone went on to join their former enemy NATO, but 2 of the most important ones didn't: Belarus and Ukraine, countries that Moscow views as vital to its security given their geographic positions, and in the case of Ukraine, its population size, being the only country on its western flank that has a population large enough that it would be difficult to conquer if it resisted. Quick side note here, Stalin actually saw the Ukrainians as such a large threat that a lot of historians argue he engineered the mass starvation of 3.5 to 5 million of them in the 1930s. Moscow has always viewed a strong and independent Ukraine as a threat, and so it's either strive to rule it directly or have it be weak enough that it could be conquered easily if need be. And herein we get to one of the main reasons why Putin decided to invade Ukraine. Ukraine was drifting away from Moscow's influence and enhancing its military ties with NATO, so it was becoming increasingly difficult to conquer. So Putin decided to use military force to achieve his aim of a weak, Russia-aligned Ukraine. And unless you've had your head under a rock for the past 3 years, of course he's failed entirely. He's actually brought the Russian nightmare scenario closer to life. The invasion has pushed Ukraine into the arms of the West, with Russian troops getting killed by NATO weaponry in what was once seen as a center of Russian influence. Ukraine has become more difficult for Moscow to dominate, not less. But Putin is not merely ready to give up, and for a few reasons, one of which being the sunk cost fallacy, as Russia has already lost 1 million casualties in Ukraine and completely devastated its relationship with the West, and so it can't simply give up without being able to declare victory somehow. On top of that, Russia has some incentive to continue pursuing its objectives through the battlefield, as long-term military predictions definitely favor them. Yet, if Putin is able to achieve at least some of his invasion's initial objectives at the negotiating table, he may be willing to call it a day. Now, those objectives have varied over time, but they're roughly the following: a declared neutral status of Ukraine so that it never joins NATO or aligns closely with the West, a limited size of the Ukrainian military, the end to all Western military assistance to Ukraine, and Ukraine surrendering territory to Russia, at the very least what Russia has taken militarily, but ideally territory that Russia has annexed but that they don't actually control. Now, all of these things add up to equal Ukraine that would be easy for Russia to conquer, but because Putin can't achieve these things on the battlefield, he'll need to compromise on at least some of them if he genuinely wants an end to the war. Now, Putin has been demonstrating some interest in negotiating an end to the conflict, but how genuine his interest is open for debate. Both the US and Ukraine have called for an immediate ceasefire to be declared before negotiations start as a demonstration of seriousness, but Putin has refused. As for him, the forces military is pressing Ukraine with every day is his main bargaining chip, so he needs to get some serious concessions at the table to tell his generals to stand down. And Putin might just be pretending to be interested in the hope of improving relations with Ukraine's main source of weapons, the US. This is because the Russian military command almost certainly believes that if the flow of those weapons stopped, they'd be able to achieve all of their objectives on the battlefield as they set to do so originally. Since Trump isn't sending any new weapons to Ukraine in order to pressure it into negotiations, Putin has the incentive to play diplomat and act like he's interested in peace for as long as possible, in order to give his forces an advantage on the battlefield. Or he could genuinely be interested in peace and is simply trying to see how weak a Ukraine he can get at the negotiating table. Hopefully, we'll see as time goes on. Okay, so up until this point, I've done something that's highly problematic but quite common when discussing Ukraine, and that's by framing this conflict as one that's primarily between the West and Russia, which entirely ignores Ukraine and the millions of Ukrainians that have been fighting for their own strong independent country. If the Ukrainian people were not willing to sacrifice everything they had, we wouldn't be having this discussion. Ukraine would have fallen easily regardless of what NATO and the US did. So then, where does Ukraine fall in these negotiations? Well, like I said, somehow Ukraine was left out of the initial discussions, as Trump sought to circumvent them and simply talk to Russia directly. He seems to see Ukraine as a country which will do whatever he says, and so he doesn't actually need their input, as he can just dictate terms of a peace agreement to them. To be fair, he does have a significant amount of leverage, as Ukraine does rely heavily on American weaponry to keep its battlefield edge. So Ukraine's leader Zelensky is in a very tough spot, having to appease Trump while also not compromise on his country's red lines. And just what are those red lines? Well, essentially, they're anything that would weaken Ukraine's ability to defend itself as a strong and independent country, and also not legitimizing Russia's invasion by recognizing any of the territory it has seized as legally Russian. To this end, Ukraine doesn't want any restrictions on its military, not to its size or to the weaponry being supplied from abroad. It also wants the ability to dictate its own foreign policy, such as by joining organizations like the EU or NATO if it wants. Something that Ukraine really wants, but which might not be a red line, is security guarantees that it won't be invaded again. This would be in the form of either NATO membership or a defensive pact with a nuclear power like the US or UK. Essentially something that tells Russia if it invades again, it will be triggering a war with a Ukrainian ally that has nukes, thus deterring Russia from invading in the first place. This is quite important to Ukraine, as it has been stabbed in the back by Russia several times before. The most prominent example is the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which came just after the collapse of the Soviet Union when Ukraine possessed the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, as it had been one of the Soviet Union's centers of military power. But under pressure from the US, UK, and Russia, it gave those weapons up in exchange for a promise not to have its territory attacked by any of those powers. So Ukraine surrendered the most powerful defensive weapons humanity has ever created and got completely betrayed by Russia when it attacked Ukraine in 2014 and again in 2022. Russia has also broken its word with Ukraine on several other agreements, and so of course Ukraine doesn't trust Russia at all and wants a major power like the US to be its protector in order to prevent another invasion. So those are the current positions of Ukraine and Russia, oversimplified, but what about the US and EU? Well, the US simply wants to rush a peace agreement through as quickly as possible, without caring much about who has to compromise more. But it's found a lot less common ground to negotiate over than it thought. After a few months of trying, Trump is quite frustrated with the entire process, currently more with Putin than Zelensky, although the opposite was true in April. He has quite a few levers to pull, and has already withdrawn weapons and intelligence support from Ukraine once in order to force its hand at the negotiating table. Now with Russia, Trump has threatened to impose secondary sanctions on countries that buy Russian oil if the Russians don't compromise a bit more. Given all of the options Trump has at his disposal, sanctions are a very timid one, and evidently the threat has not been successful yet, as Trump is disappointed with Russia's position and is threatening to walk away from facilitating the negotiations entirely. As for the EU, it's trying to support Ukraine and prevent the crossing of their red lines as much as possible, especially in the absence of US support for Ukraine. But they're doing this on the sidelines right now, as they too have not been included in the negotiations so far. So they're essentially trying to back Ukraine up against pressure from both Russia and the US. That support is absolutely critical to Ukraine, with the US administration that really doesn't care too much about Ukraine sacrificing its strength. So right now, the character of negotiations is changing entirely, with Ukraine and Russia talking to each other directly for the first time in 3 years. This began from a remark by Putin that Russia would be willing to negotiate directly with Ukraine rather than through the US. Trump saw Putin's comment and ran with it, saying that Ukraine should take up the offer immediately. Then Zelensky saw a great opportunity to show Trump that it was Putin who was not negotiating in earnest, by saying that he would go personally to the negotiations in Turkey and wait for Putin there. This was a really clever move by Zelensky, as it put the ball in Putin's court and showed Trump that he was trying his hardest to negotiate an end to it all. This all conveniently happened as Trump was making a tour of the Middle East, and Trump even said he could make a brief stop in Istanbul to attend the talks. But of course Putin chose not to meet Zelensky, as it would have been embarrassing to be seen as answering a call from a leader of a government he has described as illegitimate. Where the negotiations go from here is anyone's guess. Direct talks between Ukraine and Russia broke down quickly last week when Russia kept its outlandish demand that Ukraine withdraw troops from areas of Ukraine that Russia has annexed but doesn't physically control. A lot will depend on Trump and if he continues to push both sides into negotiations, as without that pressure, neither side really has the incentive to compromise so much that a middle ground might be found. Russia knows that it has the military advantage in a long-term war of attrition, but Ukraine will never accept existence as a weak state unable to defend itself, knowing that this would probably mean another invasion in a few years' time. Right now, its military is doing a great job of holding the Russian army at bay, and so it doesn't see any reason to effectively surrender entirely. So now we'll see if negotiations are successful or if this horrific war grinds on. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's brief discussion of who's involved in these negotiations, as well as where they stand. If you did, please share and subscribe. See ya!